and welcome to Crim Pixels. I'm going to show you a retro game and I'm going to tell you what I think about it, and I hope that's okay. This week I'll be taking a look at the original Rayman, which was released in the bright neon heyday of 1995. Originally developed by Michel Ancel, hopefully I'm saying that right, of Ubisoft, whatever, for the Atari ST, we're going to look at the title as released on another of Atari's devices, the Atari Jaguar. Why the Jaguar, you ask? Well, because I have a soft spot for that ill-fated little machine, and it had the best name of any console ever, and if you don't like it, you probably suck. And Rayman, apart from Alien vs Predator, Rayman was the Jaguar game that I wanted most, because, well, look at it, it's so cute and colourful. As you can see, the original Rayman was a side-scrolling platformer, much like the very popular titles that followed much later in the series, Rayman Origins and Rayman Legends. These two games tweaked the formula slightly, speeding things up, tightening controls, adding a whole bunch of unlockable characters, and this boosted Rayman in popularity after their initial release in 2011. But how did this original Rayman fare on its release 16 years earlier? That's a great question, me. Let's take a look at it. When it comes to Rayman, what you see is pretty much what you get, and as you can see, it looks pretty good, and that about sums things up, really. It's pretty good, but it's not perfect. Sure, it's gorgeous to look at. Large, cutesy, colourful sprites, detailed and interactive backgrounds. Really, what's not to like? Well, part of the problem is in the size of the characters. Given you can only see so much of the screen, the platforming components can be tricky, which was really a problem of the times. If you look at modern platformers with a 16:9 perspective, there's so much more that players can see, and that leaves less room for error. Here though, the large character sprites can often result in frustrating platforming, which is a bit of a pain, but they still look so good. Some games try to get around this by adding a look feature, and there's some value to that, but not so much for me. Maybe it's the Sonic fan in me, or maybe it's because I'm impatient, or both, but I always wanted to go fast. I never want to stop to look around and get my bearings, so I never really liked that feature. Anyway, Rayman. It's a platform game, again, and Rayman needs to make his way through 6 different levels, rescuing his little Electoon buddies along the way, which are locked up in cages, poor little things. He can also collect little glowing balls called tings, clever name, and 100 of these will grant him an extra life, because, like I said in my review of Porky Pig's Haunted Holiday, that's an unbreakable rule of retro platforming. As he goes along, Rayman will unlock his punch ability, and given he has hands but no arms, he doesn't need to rely on the fact that they're tethered to his body, so his punch has quite the reach to it. Later, he'll be able to grab ledges and rings and even fly by using his floating hands as helicopter blades above his head, which makes perfect sense. Interestingly, much of this is later replicated in the Origins and Legends games. I never really realised how similar the games were until now, to be honest. The difference, though, lies in the speed. This older Rayman game rewards careful exploring, but punishes impatience, whereas the newer titles want you to move quickly through the levels, but still rewards exploration. While this original title was still pretty great in its own right, I do prefer the faster-paced modern titles in the series. At the time of release, it scored quite well with critics, many calling it one of the best titles on the Jaguar, which isn't wrong, let's face it, there aren't many good titles on the Jaguar. It averaged around 75% or so across the few articles I was able to find. However, some reviews mention that the PlayStation or Saturn versions were slightly better, at least in terms of sound quality and responsiveness of control. So perhaps the Jaguar version is somewhat more sluggish than the others. I may need to test this out someday. So where did Rayman come from anyway? Another good question. Michel Ancel originally created the character as a youngish youngster back in the 80s. He further developed the character into the 90s, mentioning that he was inspired by Celtic, Chinese, and Russian fairy tales. Now, the world of Rayman is said to have been influenced by the movies made by Ghibli Studios, with its focus on harmony between nature and technology. However, the game was probably most influenced by that one title that likely influenced all platformers, Super Mario World, at least in terms of level design, the colourful world, and its use of power-ups. As I've said many times before, in the late 80s and 90s, platformers were incredibly popular. By the mid-90s though, their popularity had waned slightly. In fact, as games started to shift to 3D, 2D platformers like this were often seen as outdated. Consider the Saturn title Astal, for example. This game released in early 1995, perhaps 6 months earlier than Rayman, and was panned at the time for having no place on a 32-bit system. It's important to note at this stage though that Astal is now considered to be one of the better Saturn titles. It looked and played very similarly to Rayman, however, Rayman didn't suffer the same feedback in terms of reviews, with the Saturn port itself being cited favourably compared to Astal, even given the similarities. Was Rayman an influence on other titles? Honestly, it's hard to say, but I'd suggest there's a possibility it was an influence for modern platformers such as Ori and the Blind Forest, for example, which is similar thematically as well as in terms of art style. Of course, Rayman was reimagined in 2011 with Rayman Origins, like I said earlier, still doing similar things to the original title but making things faster, smoother, and adding co-op. With regards to ports, Rayman was also released on PS1 and Saturn, as I mentioned, and also on PC. There were also 3DO, 32X, and Super Nintendo versions planned, but these were cancelled. The 3DO and the 32X likely didn't sell well enough to justify the port, while the general consensus is that the Super Nintendo port was cancelled due to the fact that the hardware was last gen, and players were more likely to have moved on to the new shiny disc-based systems. A little later, Rayman was ported to Game Boy Color, DSi, iOS, Android, and Game Boy Advance, in which the developers broke the cardinal rule and gave players an extra life every 50 tings instead of 100, possibly because the smaller screen made the platforming even more complex. But if you do want to grab those mobile versions, you're out of luck. They were delisted in 2018. So how can you play this now? Well, it was available on the PlayStation Classic, which is no longer available and generally considered one of the worst minis, so maybe that's not your best bet, but it's also one of the only minis that I don't have, damn it, and thanks for reminding me, Rayman. But anyway, without trying to get your hands on the original, which is relatively cheap on PS1 but not so much on Saturn, and you may as well give up on the Jaguar version, I know I have, not all is lost. There was a fan remake released in 2020 called Rayman Redemption, and it's still available to download for free on Game Jolt. You can't argue with that price. Anyways, Rayman on the Atari Jaguar is an absolute gem, and a game you should totally play. It's fun, it's colourful, it was the launch pad for so many titles that followed, including those annoyingly cute rabbits. The later games were better, sure, but it doesn't mean you should just ignore this one. And that brings us to the end of another retrospective. Thanks for stopping by. I hope to see you back here next time. Let's play all the games.